It had been a long drive from Paris. The winding roads that led deeper into the French countryside seemed to stretch forever, pulling me further away from civilization with every mile. I hadn't been to the cabin in years, not since my uncle passed away, leaving it to me with the vague promise that I might find something of value. Some unfinished business, maybe, or an answer to why he'd lived so far out, so isolated, for most of his life. The sun was starting to set as I arrived, casting long shadows over the landscape. The small, old stone cabin sat at the edge of a dense forest, the kind where the trees stood so close together that it felt like the world itself had stopped at the cabin's doorstep. It looked just as I remembered: grimy windows, chipped paint, and that familiar, musty smell of wood and earth. Nothing had changed. I grabbed my bag from the back of my car and walked toward the cabin. The air was heavy, moist with the remnants of an afternoon storm. The ground was wet, soft, and there was a faint smell of mildew in the breeze. The door creaked open with a reluctant groan, as if the cabin itself didn't want me inside. I flicked the light switch, and the overhead light buzzed, dim and hesitant at first, before it settled into a weak, yellowish glow. Dust particles swirled in the air, dancing in the low light. I dropped my bag by the door and stepped further inside. The place felt colder than I remembered. It wasn't the temperature. It was something else, something intangible. The silence pressed in around me, making it difficult to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. But I knew I was. The floorboards creaked under my feet, the only sound in the cabin, and I made my way to the kitchen to start a fire in the old stove. The wood crackled as the flames caught, and the room warmed up slowly. I took a deep breath, letting the familiar scent of burning wood fill my lungs. The cabin felt more like home now, but the feeling in the air hadn't changed. The same unsettling silence clung to the walls, but this time, it felt like it was watching me. That night, I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling as the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The storm had picked up again, and it seemed like the entire forest was alive, twisting and groaning under the pressure of the storm. I tried to sleep, but the unease never left me. It was as if I could hear something out there, just beyond the reach of the storm's howling. Something moving through the trees. Couldn't sleep. Not really. Every so often, I'd hear a sound. A branch snapping, the rustle of leaves, or something shifting outside, just out of sight. It wasn't an animal, at least not a normal one. There was something deliberate about it, as if someone was circling the cabin. I sat up, listening, trying to hear it again, but the sounds had stopped. The cabin was silent once more. I shook my head, dismissing it as nothing more than the wind. Then, around midnight, I heard it again. A faint scratching at the window. Not the wind, not the trees. Someone. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it or if the storm had masked it, but it was definitely there. A soft, slow scratching, like fingernails against glass. I stood up and moved toward the window cautiously, my heart pounding. Outside, the trees swayed under the storm's force, their branches creaking, but there was nothing at the window. Nothing but the dark. I stood there, staring into the pitch-black night, my breath shallow. The storm had made the world outside seem infinite, as if it could stretch on forever, swallowing everything in its path. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something waiting. I decided to check the rest of the cabin. Moving quietly through the rooms, I checked every door and window, making sure everything was locked. The wind seemed louder now, but there was no more scratching, no more movement, but the feeling of being watched lingered, crawling up my spine and settling heavy on my shoulders. Around 2 a.m., I decided to try to sleep again. I had to. I couldn't stay awake all night, and the storm was showing no signs of stopping. As I lay back on the couch, I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the sense of unease that kept creeping back. I could still hear the wind outside, but the rest of the world had fallen quiet. There was no more scratching, no more movement, just the storm. That's when I heard it again, this time louder. A thud against the wall, followed by another, and then a scraping sound, unmistakable. Someone was outside, moving around. I bolted upright, heart hammering in my chest. There was no mistaking it this time. Someone was on the other side of the cabin, just beyond the walls. I moved to the window again, pressing my face against the glass, straining to see through the rain and darkness. There was nothing but the trees, but I wasn't convinced. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and made my way outside, my boots squelching in the wet grass. The beam of the flashlight sliced through the dark, casting long shadows across the ground. My pulse raced as I walked around the cabin, scanning the perimeter. I saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the soaked ground, the thick trees, and the sound of the storm. That's when I saw it. A faint imprint in the mud by the side of the cabin. A footprint, fresh and clear despite the rain. I crouched down, examining it. It was big, too big for any animal I could think of. It had a shape that didn't belong, almost human. My stomach twisted as I stood up, scanning the area around me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I had the overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone anymore, that something was just outside the edge of the flashlight's reach, watching. Suddenly, I heard a rustle in the trees. No wind, just a movement, and then silence. I froze. My mind raced, my pulse quickened. I had no idea who or what was out there, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay in that cabin alone. I ran back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it quickly, my hands trembling. I could hear my own breathing, loud in the silence of the cabin. My heart raced as I leaned against the door, trying to make sense of what was happening. There were no more sounds, no more scratching, no more movement, just the storm. I grabbed my things, my phone, my keys, and without thinking, I bolted out the door, running to my car. I had to leave. I couldn't be there any longer. The air felt thick with something dangerous, something I couldn't explain. As I started the car, I glanced at the cabin one last time, the lights from my headlights casting an eerie glow across the wet stone. It looked so innocent, so quiet, but I knew better now. I drove away, my eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror. As I reached the main road, I dared one last look back at the cabin, but there was no one there, no movement, just the dark and the rain. I don't know what I saw that night or who or what was watching me from the trees, but I'm certain of one thing. There's something out there, something that watches from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to move. And that cabin is just the beginning. The storm may have passed, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, in that isolated cabin in the French countryside. And I'll never go back, ever. I was 36 when it happened, though I often forget my exact age that year. It was the kind of experience that makes time blur, makes a year feel like a lifetime. My cousin Adam had just turned 40 and bought a cabin in the woods outside a small town in Ontario called Rainford. He was proud of it, always talking about fixing it up, putting in a wood-burning stove, clearing the trails around it for hiking. That kind of thing. He worked in construction and had always wanted a place off the grid. When he finally got it, he invited me up to help with some of the early work. Gutting an old bathroom, chopping wood, installing a water heater, that sort of thing. It was October 2021 when I went up there. I'd just gone through a breakup, had some vacation time saved, and didn't have anything better to do. The idea of manual labor and being surrounded by trees sounded better than sitting around in my apartment watching TV and pretending I was fine. Adam had driven down to pick me up from Kitchener, and we made the drive up together. Took about 3.5 hours. By the time we pulled up the narrow dirt road that led to his cabin, the sun was already setting. The cabin sat about a mile off the main gravel road, completely surrounded by forest on all sides, with no neighbors in sight. It wasn't fancy, just a rectangular, single-story place made of old timber with a tin roof and a small shed out back. There was a little front porch with 2 plastic chairs, and the front door was this heavy, weathered thing with a rusted handle. The windows had plastic sheeting over them to keep the cold out, and the whole place smelled like pine and dust inside. The first couple days were fine. We got to work clearing brush around the property and burned a couple big piles of deadwood. Adam showed me a stream about 15 minutes down a trail, and we walked it a few times, just enjoying the quiet. I slept on a cot in the main room while Adam had the single bedroom. We ate canned food, drank cheap beer, and talked about dumb stuff late into the night. It was peaceful. I remember thinking I should do things like this more often, but the peace didn't last. The third night was when things started to feel off. We just finished working on patching a section of the roof where water had been leaking in, and we were both exhausted. The sky had been gray all day, and the wind had picked up by evening. Around 10, we went inside, lit a fire, and turned in. I remember lying there in my sleeping bag on the cot, staring up at the rafters, listening to the wind scrape tree branches across the roof. At some point in the night, I woke up needing to piss. The fire had died down to coals, and the inside of the cabin was freezing. I got up, pulled on my boots, and slipped outside with a flashlight. The cold hit me instantly. My breath came out in big clouds, and I could barely see past the ring of trees around the clearing. I went off to the right, near the shed. There was a spot behind it we'd been using to piss. I stood there, half asleep, doing my business, when I heard a crunch of leaves off to my left. Just 1 or 2 steps, maybe 10 feet into the tree line. I froze, listened. Nothing. Just wind and a few creaks from the trees. I told myself it was a deer or something and went back inside, but I had trouble falling asleep again. The next day, Adam mentioned that he thought he heard something outside in the night too. I didn't say much. It wasn't exactly surprising to hear things in the woods. Animals, maybe the wind playing tricks. That's what I told myself anyway. That afternoon, we hiked out toward the stream again. It was colder than before, and the trail was covered in a thin layer of frost in the shaded areas. On the way back, we passed through a narrow section of trail where the trees grew in close. I remember seeing a shape, maybe 50 feet off the trail, standing perfectly still. At first I thought it was a tree, just a stump or a log. But then I looked closer and realized it was a person, standing upright, not moving. I blinked and they were gone, just like that. I didn't say anything to Adam. That night, I stayed up late, pretending to read a book while the fire popped beside me. I kept glancing toward the windows. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move past the front porch, but it was gone before I could really see. The next morning, I found boot prints in the frost outside the front door. They weren't from me or Adam. Too narrow, too long. The tread wasn't like either of our boots. Adam had Timberlands. I had steel toes with a blocky pattern. These were almost sleek. I showed him and he shrugged it off, said maybe they were old and we hadn't noticed. But I could see in his face that he didn't really believe that. That day, we stuck close to the cabin, worked on clearing out the inside of the shed. It was packed with junk from the last owner, rusted tools, paint cans, some old hunting gear. There was a smell in there too, like mildew and something else I couldn't place. While Adam worked on sorting through a pile of tarps, I walked around the shed and checked out the back. That's when I found it. Something that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. Behind the shed, just where the trees started again, I found a pile of dead birds, maybe a dozen. All small, robins, jays, maybe a sparrow or two. Their bodies were arranged in a neat circle, and every one of them had its head crushed. Not torn off, crushed. I stood there for a long time just staring at them. Then I kicked snow over the whole thing and didn't tell Adam. That night was the worst. Started around 2 in the morning. I was wide awake, heart pounding in my chest. I don't know why I woke up, but something felt wrong. The fire was out. The cabin was dead silent. I got up slowly, reached for the flashlight, and crept toward the window. Outside in the front yard was a man. He was just standing there, not doing anything, not moving, just standing facing the cabin. He wasn't wearing any kind of jacket or gloves, even though it had to be below freezing. He wore jeans, a tight dark shirt, and what looked like thin shoes. His arms hung by his sides, his head tilted slightly to one side, like he was trying to listen. I backed away from the window, not breathing. My skin felt like it was crawling. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. Adam was still asleep in the other room. I didn't want to wake him, I didn't want to make a sound. I just stood there, staring at the floor, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like forever, I worked up the nerve to peek again. He was gone. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I told Adam everything. I told him about the man, the dead birds, the boot prints. He didn't say much, just nodded and looked out the window. Then he told me he'd found something too. The night before, he'd gone out for firewood around midnight and found a small bundle tied with twine hanging from a tree branch out back. Inside was a dead mouse and some kind of bone shard. He hadn't wanted to tell me and freak me out. We spent the day packing. No more fixing the roof, no more clearing brush. We wanted out, but the road back to the main gravel road was flooded. A shallow stream that ran across the road had swollen in the night from the rain and blocked the path. We couldn't drive through it safely. We were stuck. That afternoon, we double-checked all the locks on the doors and windows. We brought the axe inside, and Adam kept a hammer on the table. We didn't talk much, just sat and waited for morning. Around midnight, we heard footsteps on the porch. Clear, heavy footsteps, just pacing back and forth from one side of the porch to the other. We didn't move, didn't speak, just sat there, staring at the door. Then the footsteps stopped. For a long time, nothing. Then a single knock. Not loud, just a soft, slow knock. Then silence. We stayed like that until sunrise. The stream had gone down just enough by morning. We didn't eat or drink, just threw our gear in the truck and left. We didn't look back. We didn't talk about it for a long time. 2 months later, Adam sold the cabin. Never went back. He told the buyer it needed repairs and wasn't winterized. Never mentioned the man or the birds or the knock. I never saw the cabin again either. I don't want to. To this day, I don't know who that man was, or what he wanted, or how long he'd been watching us. But I think about him sometimes. I see him in my mind, standing in the cold, arms at his sides, head tilted, and I wonder what would have happened if we'd opened the door. It was the fall of 2012 when I drove up north to spend a few weeks at a hunting cabin my uncle once used, tucked deep in the Black River State Forest in Wisconsin. I was 34 at the time, divorced, and just looking to get away from everything. The cabin had been passed down to me after he died in a car crash the previous winter. I hadn't had the energy to deal with it until then, but when the stress of my job and the silence of my empty house became too loud, I packed up my truck and drove 5 hours from Milwaukee to the middle of nowhere. I didn't tell many people I was going, just left a voicemail for my brother and a note for my neighbor. I didn't want to be contacted unless it was important. I brought a rifle, a bow, and some gear. No plans to bag anything big, just small game, rabbits maybe, or a deer if one crossed paths. More than anything, I wanted the silence. The cabin was small. 1 room, a fireplace, a table, a few chairs, and a cot. It had no electricity, no running water, just a hand pump outside, an outhouse down the slope, and a propane stove I had to relight with a match each time I used it. My uncle had lived rough. I didn't mind it. I grew up going to that cabin in the summers, fishing with him, learning to hunt squirrels and ducks. The place had that thick wooden smell, pine and mildew and old smoke, that I somehow missed. The first day was quiet. I cleaned out the cabin, swept up mouse droppings, patched up a leak in the roof with some tarp and nails I found in the shed. That night, I sat out front with a beer, wrapped in a flannel coat, watching the dark pour in over the trees. No sounds except wind and the distant call of a barred owl. I felt better than I had in months. The days blended. I set traps, hiked trails, and tracked deer signs through the muddy ground. The cold helped. It stripped away the noise in my head. I'd wake up with frost on my boots and fingers stiff from the chill. But I didn't care. The air smelled clean. I ate jerky, canned soup, and once the rabbit I caught. I'd skin it out back, where the old stump was stained dark from years of the same. There was something simple about the routine. No phone, no news, no people. About a week in, things started to feel off. It was small stuff at first. One morning, I found the front door slightly ajar, even though I was sure I had latched it before bed. It was old and warped, and the wind could push it open if I didn't wedge it tight. So I brushed it off. Then, a few nights later, I heard movement outside around 2 in the morning. I was sleeping on the cot with my coat over me when I woke up to faint crunching, like footsteps on frost. I sat up, grabbed the rifle, and waited. It stopped. Nothing after that. No knock, no sound of anything leaving. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. I figured it could have been a raccoon, maybe a deer. That's what I told myself. But I started noticing other things too. The traps I set were sometimes moved. One was sprung with nothing in it, like something had deliberately triggered it without getting caught. Another time, the trap itself was gone entirely. I found it later, 30 yards into the trees, snapped shut and empty. No drag marks, no blood. It was just sitting there like someone picked it up and moved it. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I've hunted a long time. I know animals can be weird, smart even, but not that smart. On the 10th day, I found tracks near the shed. Human tracks, too big to be mine. I wear a size 10 boot, and these were at least a 12 or 13. I checked all around the cabin. They came from the east tree line, circled the shed, and disappeared back into the woods. No vehicle tracks, no sign anyone came in by road. It rained the day before, so they were fresh. That shook me. I didn't have cell signal, so I couldn't call anyone. I had a battery-powered radio, but it only picked up a few AM stations, and they weren't worth much out here. I walked the perimeter, checked for signs of other camps, but saw nothing. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat in the dark with the rifle across my knees, listening. I didn't sleep at all. At some point near dawn, I must have drifted off. When I woke up, the front door was open again. Wide open. I had locked it, wedged it with a chunk of firewood, too. The log was pushed aside like it weighed nothing. I jumped up, rifle in hand, and scanned the area. No movement, but more tracks in the frost outside. The same ones. Big, deep, going in circles around the cabin like someone was pacing. That's when I knew someone was out there. I thought about leaving, but the truck was parked a ways down the hill near the old service road. I had to carry water from the spring, and it made more sense to park near it. I didn't want to go out in the dark again. I figured if I made it to morning, I'd pack up and drive out. But the next night, it got worse. Around midnight, I heard something tapping on the wall. Not the door, the back wall. I froze. It was steady. Tap, 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 like a stick or a rock. Not loud, not fast, just enough to let me know it was there. It moved. Tap, tap, now closer to the window. I sat in the shadows, rifle ready, breathing through my teeth. It stopped. Then I heard footsteps, fast, circling the cabin, crunching on the frost. I stood up, crept to the window, and peeked through the slit in the curtain. Nothing. Then a bang on the opposite wall. I spun, heart pounding. Another bang. Then silence. I waited for maybe 2 hours. Nothing else. I didn't dare sleep. At sunrise, I packed everything, tossed food in a bin, grabbed my gear, slung the rifle, and left. I didn't clean, didn't lock the door, just walked fast down to the truck. Frost was thick on the windshield. I scraped it with my knife, hands shaking. I drove fast down the dirt road, not caring about the bumps. I made it out to the highway by noon and kept driving south until I hit La Crosse, where I finally got phone signal. I called my brother, told him I was cutting the trip short. Didn't say why. He didn't press. I stayed with him that night. The next day, I went to the sporting goods store and bought trail cameras. The kind with motion sensors. I needed to know if I'd lost my mind or if someone was really out there. 2 weeks later, I went back. I didn't sleep there. Just set the cameras, 5 of them, facing the cabin, the shed, and the trails around the perimeter. I left them for a week. When I came back, I took the cards and reviewed them on my laptop at home. 4 days in, around midnight, the one by the back wall caught movement. A man, tall, wearing a jacket and a cap. Couldn't see his face. He stood near the wall for 5 minutes. Didn't move, just stood there. Then he started walking in circles. Slow, deliberate. Then he picked up something from the ground, a branch maybe, and began tapping the wall. Exactly like I heard. Tap, tap, tap. My blood went cold. He moved to the window, just stood in front of it like he was looking in. Then he turned, stared directly at the camera, and walked off into the woods. The next night, the same thing. Same man, different spot. He didn't go inside. He didn't try the door. Just lingered, like he knew I was gone but still wanted to be there. The last video was the worst. It showed the man crouched beside the firewood pile. Not moving, just crouched, staring straight at the door. He stayed there for an hour. I didn't go back after that. I sold the cabin 2 months later to a couple from Minnesota. Told them it was a nice quiet spot for duck hunting. I didn't mention the videos. I deleted them eventually. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to carry the proof of what I already knew. Whoever that man was, he wasn't just passing through. He knew the area. He knew how to stay hidden. He had been watching me, maybe for days before I ever noticed. Maybe the first night I slept there, he was already out in the trees, just watching. I hate thinking about that. I've gone hunting since, but never alone. Never that deep. And I always tell people where I'm going now. I carry extra batteries, more ammo, and keep a satellite phone on me. People think the woods are peaceful. I used to think so too. But some things are worse than bears or wolves. Some things walk on 2 legs, breathe the same air, wear clothes and wait in silence. And they don't need a reason to be out there. They just are. And that's enough. I was 37 when I made the worst decision of my life. It was a cold fall in 2014, late October, the kind of season when you can smell winter in the air even though the leaves are still falling. I'd taken some time off from work, construction in a small town near Billings, Montana, and figured I'd finally do the one thing I'd been putting off for years: hike out to Dry Pine Hollow. I'd heard about it since I was a kid. My uncle used to hunt near there back in the 80s. He'd talk about this spot where nobody went anymore. Said there was an old hunting cabin tucked deep into the woods, past the fire trails, past the seasonal creeks, out where maps start getting useless. Nobody used the place anymore. It had belonged to a guy named Harris Whitaker, some loner who'd built it with his own hands. Apparently, Harris had just vanished sometime in the mid-90s. Never came back. No one ever figured out where he went. I thought about that cabin for years. Everyone always brushed it off, said it probably fell apart by now or got buried in snow in winter and never got found again. But something about that place kept nagging at me. Maybe I was bored. Maybe I just wanted to get away for a few days and clear my head. I'd just gone through a rough breakup, and the idea of total isolation had a strange kind of appeal. So I packed up a week's worth of gear, loaded my backpack with water, dried food, a hunting knife, my dad's old Remington, and set off with my dog, Gus. Gus was a 3-year-old black lab mix. Quiet, smart, and the only company I trusted out there. The first day of the hike was tough but manageable. I followed the old service trail leading away from the main logging roads. It had rained a few days earlier, so everything was muddy, the kind of mud that sucks your boots in and holds on tight. I walked 12 miles that day, all uphill, following a paper map I printed out from an old forestry site. I marked the cabin's supposed location in red pen, but I knew it wouldn't be exact. GPS was useless out there. No signal, no bars, just trees and cold air. By the second day, the trail had thinned out into nothing. I had to bushwhack through dense brush, sidestep fallen logs, and occasionally backtrack when I hit impassable terrain. It was slow going, but Gus stayed close, sniffing out the path ahead. That night, I set up camp near a small rocky stream. The stars were out, the sky was clear, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. It was early morning on the 3rd day when I finally saw it. The cabin. It wasn't much. A small, rectangular structure, maybe 25 by 15 feet, sagging under the weight of time. The roof had a hole near the far edge, and part of the front porch had collapsed inward. The wood was dark, soaked with years of snow and rain, and covered in patches of moss. It sat at the edge of a clearing, the forest behind it thick and silent. I stood there for a while, just looking at it. I'd actually found it. After all these years, it was real. Gus sniffed the air, tail low, body tense. That should have been my first warning. I stepped up onto the remains of the porch and gently pushed the door open. Creaked like a horror movie cliche. Inside, the air was stale and cold. Dust floated in the beams of sunlight cutting through the broken roof. There was an old wood stove in one corner, rusted and black. A rickety table stood against the far wall, its legs uneven. A cot with a moldy mattress lay near the back, next to a smashed window. But what caught my eye was the stuff still inside. Rusted tools hung on the wall. A few cans of food, long expired, sat on a shelf. A hunting rifle leaned against the corner. And on the table, beneath a thick layer of dust, were scattered papers. Notebooks, a few folded maps, and a small, leather-bound journal. I wasn't expecting that. I'd assumed the place would be totally empty, forgotten, but it felt like someone had left in a hurry. Or maybe they'd intended to come back but never did. I spent the rest of the day clearing out the cabin. Swept the floor, reinforced the broken porch with some scrap wood from a nearby shed, and fixed the roof with a tarp I'd brought. I planned to stay a night or two, just soak in the silence, maybe do a little sketching or writing. I wasn't looking for trouble. I just wanted space. That night, I made a small fire in the stove. Took forever to get going. The logs I found were damp and brittle, but eventually, I got it warm enough to take the edge off. Gus curled up near the door, ears twitching every now and then. I read through some of the journal. It was Harris's, no doubt. The entries were short, to the point. Mostly notes about hunting, weather, supplies. But around the middle of the book, things got weird. Not supernatural, not ghosts or anything like that. Just weird in a real, unsettling way. He wrote about hearing movement outside the cabin at night. Not animals, not wind, something else. I heard it again, 2 nights in a row. Sounds like breathing, but not close. Far off. Watching. Another page read, tracks near the back window. Not mine. Too deep, too wide. Not elk. One entry toward the end just said, if it's back again tonight, I'll stay awake. That was the last one. I didn't sleep much after that. At some point in the night, Gus growled. Low, quiet, but I heard it. My hand went straight to my rifle. I sat up and listened. Nothing, just the wind outside. I stayed like that for hours, heart racing, eyes scanning the dark. Eventually, I drifted off. The next morning, I found prints outside. Human prints. Or at least they looked human. Barefoot. Long, wide. No tread marks like boots would make. No claw marks like an animal. Just feet. Leading from the edge of the trees to the side of the cabin and back again. I measured one with my hand. Bigger than mine by a good 3 inches. I told myself someone must have come through. Another hunter. A squatter. But who the hell hikes out this far, barefoot, in late October? I should have left then. Packed up and gone. But I didn't. The following night was colder. I built the fire higher. Gus wouldn't settle. He paced the cabin, growling now and then. Around midnight, I heard it. Not footsteps. Breathing. It was faint. Barely audible. But it was there. A slow, steady breath. Like someone trying not to be heard. I killed the fire instantly. Sat in the dark with the rifle on my lap. Eyes fixed on the door. Gus stood next to me. Body stiff. Tail down. The breathing came and went. Sometimes I thought it was just wind in the trees. Sometimes I didn't. By morning, it was gone. That day, I found more footprints. They circled the cabin. Twice. I followed them for a bit into the trees, but they stopped at a rocky outcrop like the person or thing just vanished. I was done pretending this was normal. I packed up everything and decided to leave at first light the next day. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat up with Gus, fire burning low, gun across my knees. I didn't read. I didn't eat. I just listened. At some point, I heard something hit the side of the cabin. A dull thud. Then again, like something was throwing rocks. I stepped out with my flashlight and rifle, scanned the woods. Nothing. But when I turned around to go back inside, I saw something that froze my blood, a figure just barely visible at the edge of the trees. Tall, still, watching, not moving, not hiding, just there. I didn't shout. I didn't shoot. I just backed into the cabin, shut the door, and bolted it. By dawn, the figure was gone, but the footprints were closer now, right up against the cabin walls. One on the porch. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't say anything. I just grabbed my pack, called Gus, and started walking. The hike back should have taken 2 days. I did it in 1. I didn't stop, not even to drink. Gus stayed close the whole time, never running ahead, never wandering. He knew something was wrong. We made it back to my truck by nightfall. I drove without stopping, without looking back, all the way into town. I never told anyone about it. Not in full. Just said I found the cabin and it creeped me out. Nobody pressed. A few weeks later, I went to look up Harris Whitaker. I couldn't find any records of him past 1996. No death certificate. No missing person report. Nothing. Like he'd just stopped existing. I still think about that figure sometimes. That breathing. Those bare footprints in the cold October dirt. I never went back to Dry Pine Hollow. Never will. But I know that cabin is still there, rotting slowly in the forest, full of silence, watching, and something out there, whoever or whatever it was, it didn't want to be found, and it sure as hell didn't want me there. I was 34 that year, working part-time as a carpenter's assistant in a small town called Larnwick, up north in Saskatchewan. The work was seasonal and that year had been slow. There were just too many guys doing the same thing and not enough people needing help. So, when my old coworker Greg told me about a short job that paid under the table, I didn't think twice. He'd gotten a call from some guy named Alton who needed help fixing up a cabin on his late uncle's land. The place had sat abandoned for years. Now the family wanted to fix it up and sell it before the land taxes caught up. Greg couldn't go, so he passed the gig on to me. Alton was offering $500 just to clean out the place, patch up some walls, and get it ready for the real estate photos. Sounded easy. I'd have to stay there overnight since it was 3 hours out into the bush, past a place called Torson Creek. But I didn't mind. I'd camped before. I had tools, a beat-up old truck, and no other plans for that weekend. It was early October, not cold enough for snow, but the air had that wet, smoky smell like the season was about to turn. The trees were already going orange. I loaded up the truck on a Thursday morning and started the drive. The directions were pretty simple until the last half hour. Past Torson Creek, I had to follow a logging road that cut through a long stretch of Crown land. No service, no signs, nothing but dirt and potholes. I stopped twice to make sure I hadn't missed a turn, but I eventually found the rusted gate with an old chain lock hanging off the post. It wasn't locked, just looped through. I swung it open, drove down the trail another half mile, and finally saw the cabin. It was smaller than I expected. Just one story, square-shaped, with a tin roof that had gone dull with rust. The siding was wood, faded gray, and the front porch sagged in the middle. There was an old outhouse behind it and a half-collapsed shed to the left, almost swallowed by weeds. No neighbors, no roads, just forest. I parked off to the side and got out. The ground was soft from rain earlier in the week. My boots sank a little with every step. The place smelled of wet moss and old pine. I walked up to the front door and tried the handle. Unlocked. Inside it was stale. Dust clung to everything. The windows were fogged from the inside, and a thin layer of grime coated the sills. The furniture had been covered with old sheets, most of which were stained and torn. There was a stone fireplace, an old iron stove, and one small hallway that led to a bedroom and what passed for a bathroom. Just a closet-sized space with a sink and dry-rotted floorboards. It wasn't creepy at first, just empty. I brought in my sleeping bag, my tools, and some canned food. I wasn't expecting luxury, just a roof and a weekend of work. I started with the windows, scraped them clean, opened them up to air the place out. Then I took the sheets off the furniture and started hauling trash into a burn pile out back. There were old papers, boxes of rusted tools, broken dishes, rat nests. The bedroom had a collapsed bed frame and a moth-eaten mattress. I dragged it all out and left it near the shed. Around 4 p.m., I took a break, ate a sandwich. The sun was already getting low, filtered through the trees. It got quiet in a way that pressed on your ears. Not peaceful, just empty. No traffic, no voices, not even wind. That was when I first got a strange feeling, like I shouldn't be there, but I pushed it down. I told myself I was just tired from driving. I worked until dark, then lit a fire in the fireplace and sat on the old couch. I didn't have cell service, so I read an old magazine I found tucked in a drawer. Around 9, I unrolled my sleeping bag in the corner and tried to fall asleep, but I kept waking up. Not to sounds, just a feeling, that kind of half-awake sense that something's off. I'd sit up, look around the room, wait, then lay back down. That happened 4 or 5 times. Each time I felt more wired. The last time, just past 2 a.m., I sat up and listened. The fire had burned low. The only sound was the pop of the last coals. I swear I heard something outside. Maybe a footstep, maybe just a branch snapping. I didn't go out to check. I told myself animals wander around cabins all the time, but I didn't sleep after that. I waited until morning and got straight to work again. Cleaned out the kitchen, fixed a sagging shelf, removed a broken door from the bathroom. Around noon, I went to check the shed. It was more collapsed than I thought. One wall leaning outward, the roof sunken in. Inside, there were boxes, old tools, an old chainsaw, and a plastic tarp covering something heavy. I lifted it. It was a deer, or what was left of one. Just bones, mostly. Ribs, spine, and part of the skull. Picked clean but old, maybe a year or more. The bones were piled neatly under the tarp. That wasn't normal. Hunters don't stash bones like that. And even if some animal dragged it in, it wouldn't be so clean. I stood there for a long minute, not sure what to do. Then I covered it back up and told myself it didn't matter. Just a weird find in an old shed. That night, it rained. I stayed inside, cooked beans on the stove, and tried to relax. I kept the fire going until midnight, then zipped up in my sleeping bag and laid there staring at the ceiling. At some point, I heard the shed creak. It wasn't the wind. I know the sound of pressure would make when it shifts naturally. This was like someone leaned on it. I waited, then I heard something else. A click, metal on metal, then quiet again. I stayed perfectly still. I listened for 20, maybe 30 minutes. Nothing. Finally, I got up slowly. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the front window, careful not to make the floor creak. I looked out. The shed door was open. It hadn't been earlier. That's when I started to worry for real. I didn't go outside. I locked the cabin door. Not that it would help much, and stayed up the rest of the night, flashlight in hand. By morning, the shed door was closed again, but not all the way. It hung crooked, like it had been opened and pushed shut without care. I walked out there, heart pounding. I opened the door all the way. The tarp was gone. So were the bones. All that was left was a dark patch of dirt. I backed away slowly, walked straight back to the cabin, and grabbed my keys. I didn't even pack up my tools. I just wanted to leave. I threw everything in the truck and started it up. The engine stalled. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, checked the battery intact. Fuel was fine. Everything looked normal, but it just wouldn't turn over. It was like something was off with the ignition. I spent 2 hours trying to fix it. Then I gave up. I didn't have a radio, no signal. I was stuck. I spent the rest of the day double-checking the windows, boarding up the shed door with a piece of plywood I found. I tried to stay calm. I told myself maybe it was animals. Maybe some scavenger dragged off the bones. Maybe the shed door blew open. But deep down, I didn't believe that. That night, I slept with a hammer in my hand. I didn't even try to sleep much, just closed my eyes for a few seconds at a time. I kept hearing things outside. Not movement, just quiet things. Breathing, scraping. In the morning, I went out to check the truck again. All 4 tires had been slashed. Not torn, not chewed, cut. Clean knife slices across the sidewalls. That was when I realized someone didn't want me leaving. I made a decision then. I was going to walk out. 20 miles back to Torsen Creek. I packed a bag with food and water, left the rest, and started on foot. I made it 5 miles before I found the path blocked. A tree had fallen. Not fresh. Looked like it had been cut. Deliberately dropped across the narrow road. And next to it, wedged between two rocks, was the tarp. Folded neatly, just sitting there. That was when I knew I wasn't alone out there. I ran. Not back to the cabin, just off the road, into the woods. I found a ridge and followed it for an hour until I came across a hunter's blind. Old but usable. I climbed inside, shut the flap, and waited. I figured I'd stay hidden until night, then walk under cover of dark. But just before sunset, I saw someone, about 100 yards off, just walking through the trees. Not hunting, not carrying anything, just walking slow, looking around, looking for me. I waited until they passed. Then I stayed put. I didn't move until the sky went black. Then I climbed down and started walking. No flashlight, just moonlight. I made it all the way to the gate by dawn. That rusted chain was gone. I stepped out onto the gravel road, boots blistered, knees shaking. The farmer picked me up an hour later. I didn't say much, just told him I'd been stranded. I never reported it. I didn't even go back for my tools. That cabin was probably sold a few months later. Fixed up. Maybe someone lives there now. Maybe they never saw anything strange. Maybe it was just me. But I don't think so. There was someone out there. Someone who lived in those woods. I was 38 when it happened. This was back in late autumn of 2017. My name's Mark, and at the time I was working as a freelance surveyor, taking on private contracts out west in Montana. Most of the year I lived out of a small house I rented in Helena, but whenever a job took me out into the backcountry, I'd sometimes stay in one of the old cabins scattered across state land, especially if I knew I'd be out there for more than a couple days. Some of those cabins were run down. Some weren't even really cabins anymore. But this one up on the eastern slope of Flathead Ridge was still solid. A guy I worked with once told me about it. Said he used it twice, left it stocked, and that it stayed dry. I had a contract that week to map and mark a remote patch of woodland being prepped for a private sale. About 3,000 acres of rough, uneven, heavily wooded slope. It was a real mess to get into. Only one dirt trail cut through the whole area, and it wasn't wide enough for a vehicle. I had to leave my truck locked behind a cattle gate and hike the rest. First couple days I worked the southern edge, then moved my way north. I carried in my usual gear, compass, maps, field GPS, a small emergency beacon, and my pack. I also had my hunting rifle slung over my shoulder. Not because I expected trouble, but because I'd had a close call once with a cougar while marking a tree line near the Idaho border. You learn fast out here, better to carry something and not need it. By the third day, I'd made it to the northern boundary and was running low on energy and daylight. The air was already cooling off fast, and once the sun dipped behind the ridge, it felt like winter. I hadn't passed anyone out there, no sign of hikers or hunters. The nearest road was about 7 miles south. That kind of isolation can feel peaceful until it doesn't. I remembered the cabin then. The guy who told me about it said it was up on a small rise not far from where I was. I scanned the edge of the tree-line above and, sure enough, I saw a sloped roof just poking out through the branches. The trail was barely visible, more of a path really cut through waist-high brush. I climbed up slowly, legs burning from the long day, and found the place. It was about the size of a garage. One room, wooden planks weathered to a dark gray, window on one side, and a small brick chimney that leaned just a little. The door creaked but held. Inside it was dry, dusty, sure, but dry. There was an old cot against the wall, a pile of folded blankets that looked like they hadn't been touched in years, and a rusted potbelly stove with a pile of split logs beside it. I closed the door, dropped my pack, and sat on the edge of the cot. My boots ached. My fingers were stiff. I lit the lantern I carried and started a fire in the stove, and for a while it felt like I'd made the right call. I cooked up some of the instant food I brought, rice and jerky mostly, and sat on a wooden crate, eating slowly, listening to the crackling of the stove. The wind picked up outside, brushing branches against the roof. Once or twice I thought I heard something heavier, something that didn't sound like wind or animals, but I brushed it off. Sound travels weird in the woods. You think something is close, and it's a deer 200 yards away. Still, I double-checked the latch on the door before lying down. I kept the lantern burning low and the rifle beside me on the cot. Something about the air felt off, like the pressure was wrong. I chalked it up to exhaustion. Around midnight, I woke up. It wasn't the wind. It was something sharper. A quick, dry scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. I sat up, blinking, listening. The stove still glowed faint orange. The lantern flickered. Then I heard it again, scratch, scratch, this time lower, right at the door. I stood slowly, grabbed the rifle without turning on more light, and stepped toward the entrance. My boots were silent on the dirt floor. The scratching stopped. I waited. Then something heavy shifted just outside. Something bipedal. I pulled open the door and raised the rifle, expecting a bear maybe, or some kind of scavenger. Nothing was there. I stepped out onto the porch, if you could call it that. It was just a few planks laid in the dirt. The night was cold enough to make my breath visible. The trees were still. No wind now. No animal sounds either. Not even insects. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint but sharp, like rotting meat mixed with wet hair. It came in short bursts, like something downwind was turning its head. I turned back into the cabin, locked the door again, and this time I didn't go back to sleep. The next morning, everything looked normal. Nothing disturbed. No tracks. I even checked the back and sides of the cabin. Nothing but leaves and frost. Still, I decided to finish the final leg of the mapping job that day and head back south. I didn't want another night there. I covered about 4 miles before the clouds thickened and the air turned bitter. By late afternoon, it started to snow. Not heavy, but enough to make navigating risky. I didn't want to be sliding down a slope blind, so I turned back reluctantly toward the cabin. I figured I'd head out first thing in the morning. That night, things got worse. It started with the same scratching, but this time it circled the cabin. It moved from the front door to the sidewall around the back, then stopped under the window. I didn't open the door. I just stood there, breathing as quietly as I could, rifle ready. The smell came back, stronger now, like something had rolled in roadkill. I heard a soft thud against the back wall, then silence. When morning came, I checked again. Still nothing. But when I walked to the back, I found something I hadn't noticed before. Hair. Long, coarse strands clinging to a nail jutting from the wall. It looked like deer hair, but darker, almost black, and it reeked. I packed up everything, doused the fire, and left. The snow had stopped, but the trail back was rough. I made it maybe 2 miles before I spotted it. At first, I thought it was another surveyor, someone else on foot, maybe lost. But as I got closer, something felt off. The figure was too thin, the limbs too long, and it wasn't walking, it was crouching, just off the trail, still as stone. I stopped, turned its head. I don't even know how to describe that face. It looked like something halfway between a person and a deer, but wrong. The eyes were too deep, the mouth too low, and the skin looked pulled tight like leather stretched over a frame. Then it stood up. It didn't run. It didn't growl or charge. It just stared. Then it mirrored me, step for step as I backed away. Not fast, not slow, just steady. I turned and walked, not running, because some instinct told me not to. I kept my rifle up, heart pounding, every step planned. I didn't look back again until I was halfway down the slope and could see the gate where my truck was parked. It wasn't behind me. I climbed into the cab, locked the doors, and sat there shaking. When I finally felt calm enough to drive, I pulled out, drove all the way to Helena, and didn't stop until I was back in my rental. That night, I took a shower, packed my gear away, and tried to sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard something outside the house, a soft scrape. I looked through the blinds and didn't see anything. But in the morning, I found footprints in the frost by the side window. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet. I filed the final report for that land and never took another job near Flathead Ridge again. I never went back to that cabin. I never even told anyone the full story. Not my friends, not my coworkers. But I did start locking every door and window at night. I installed cameras. I moved to a place closer to town. Not because I'm scared, not exactly, but because I know what I saw was real. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man. And it wasn't something confused or sick. It was watching me, following me, mimicking me. That's what scared me the most. It didn't attack. It didn't roar. It didn't charge. It watched. And I don't think I was the first person it had seen up there. I was 38 when I took the job that led me to that cabin. It was late October of 2016, and I had just left a security company in Manchester after nearly 12 years. Things had gone south fast, new management, pay cuts, and more hours with less structure. I had no wife, no kids, and after renting the same flat for almost a decade, I realized I had no real reason to stay. A buddy of mine from my old job, John, had mentioned this property management gig up north near the Scottish border. Remote properties, some government-owned, some private, all needing people to do maintenance, inventory, or simply check-ins for insurance and security. I applied, and 2 weeks later I was driving up the A74 in a beat-up van with a crate of tools, a backpack, and an old .22 rifle I kept mostly out of habit. I wasn't a hunter, but I didn't like being alone in the woods completely empty-handed. The first few weeks were simple enough. I bounced between some abandoned farmhouses, a ranger post that hadn't been used in 5 years, and a burnt-down storage shed. I logged everything, took photos, replaced locks, the kind of work that lets your mind wander a bit, though you still had to stay sharp for old nails and rotten floors. The company, Mid-North Holdings, they called themselves, sent me the location of a cabin called Site 12. No address, just a set of coordinates and a basic outline. Overnight security check, the email said. Possible signs of recent break-in. Stay through the night. File your report in the morning. That was it. It was about a 2-hour drive from the main office they'd set up in Dumfries. After about 40 minutes on a proper road, the track got rough. Narrow, muddy, and filled with half-buried stones that threatened to snap an axle. I made it up the trail just before dark, parked near a moss-covered boulder, and did a quick sweep of the outside. It was a squat, square thing, plain timber boards, steep roof, one small chimney, and just a single door. No porch, no lights. The windows were dusty, a few with small cracks, but nothing open or clearly damaged. I didn't see any tracks in the mud, though by then the light was almost gone and the rain had started. Inside was dry, cold but dry. The floorboards creaked in that long-settled way that meant no one had stepped on them in a while. The interior was bare bones. 1 table, 2 chairs, a bunk, and an old cast-iron stove in the corner. A few shelves with some tin cans and expired beans. No lights, of course. I had my lantern and a set of small battery lamps I clipped around the beams. The rain picked up hard by 7 p.m., drumming loud against the roof. The air smelled like old wood and mouse droppings. I set my things down, made sure the door was locked, and sat on the bunk going through my inspection sheet. The first few hours passed slow. I wrote down the condition of the door, the chimney, the windows, and noted there were no visible signs of forced entry. Around 9:30, I heard a knock, not at the door, on the wall just beside the far window. One single thud, like someone knocking on wood with their knuckles. I froze. I waited. Nothing. The rain masked a lot of sound, but this had been sharp. I grabbed the flashlight and walked to the window. I couldn't see anything, just the glare of rain and wet trees. I opened the door and shone the light into the trees. Still nothing. The rain slapped against my coat and pooled at the edge of my boots. No movement, no footprints, no broken branches. I stood there a while, just listening, and then shut the door and bolted it again. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an old branch came loose and hit the wall. Maybe something fell from the roof. But 10 minutes later, I heard another sound. This time it was different. Not a knock, but a scrape long, slow, against the wooden wall behind the bunk. I got up quickly, lantern in one hand, rifle in the other. The sound stopped as I approached. The back of the cabin was against a slope, so the window on that side was higher up, no easy access from outside. I opened the back window slowly and pointed the light out. Just the slope, a few scattered rocks, and dark trees. Still, I didn't feel right. The kind of unease that crawls up slow and wraps around your ribs. I stayed up. I didn't sleep. I put the rifle beside the bunk and sat with my boots on, watching the window. The rain got heavier. Around 1 a.m., the scraping came again, this time at the front. Shorter, then a quiet tap on the glass. I stood up, fast, and moved to the window. There was someone standing there. Not clear, not a face, just a shape. A tall, broad figure, maybe 10 feet away, standing in the rain, not moving. No flashlight, no sound. Just standing, shoulders hunched slightly. Couldn't breathe right. I stepped back and reached for the rifle, keeping my eyes locked on the shape. It didn't move. I blinked, looked again. It was gone. I flung the door open and shone the beam into the woods. Empty, no movement, no sound but the rain and the wind through the trees. I walked 20 feet out, checking the ground. No footprints, just my own already filling with water. I went back inside, locked the door again, and slid the table across it. Then I turned off all the lights. Maybe that sounds stupid, but I felt like the lights made me a target. I sat in the dark, only the faint glow of the lantern, and listened. By 2:30, I heard something behind the cabin again. This time it wasn't scraping. It was breathing, heavy, close. I could hear it right against the back wall, just beyond where my bunk sat. Low, wet breaths, like someone catching it after a long run. I didn't move. I didn't speak. Just sat, staring at the floor, rifle resting across my lap. Kept on like that for maybe 5 minutes. Then it stopped. Nothing. No footsteps walking away. No retreating sound. Just silence. At first light, I was outside, boots soaked, breath steaming in the cold air. I did a full sweep. No prints, no damage, but the grass behind the cabin was flattened, wet and matted like something had stood there a while. That was the only thing I found. I filed the report with vague wording, unconfirmed presence, possible animal activity, no clear evidence of break-in. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I didn't go back. Not for a long time. Months passed. Spring came. They offered me another northern post and I turned it down. I stuck to the lowlands, closer to towns, closer to people. It wasn't until over a year later that I saw the file again. Site 12. Another inspector had been sent. A guy named Graham, mid-40s, ex-military. He quit the same night he stayed there. No explanation. Just packed up and left the company within 2 days. No formal complaint, no report. They shut the cabin down after that. Officially, they listed it as unusable due to structural decay. But I knew it was more than that, and I never told anyone what really happened. No one would believe it anyway. There was nothing supernatural. No ghost, no monster, just a man, or something that used to be one. Someone who still walks those woods, watching the empty cabin, waiting for someone else to stay the night. I kept working another 2 years before I left that job for good. I moved south, got a small house near Leeds. Quiet place, flat land. You can see anyone coming from miles away. Some nights, when the rain starts and the wind picks up, I think about that cabin. About the breath on the other side of the wall, the figure in the rain, the silence that followed. I still keep the rifle by the bed. I never saw that shape again, never heard that sound. But I know it's still out there. And if you ever get a job that tells you to spend the night alone in some remote cabin up north, don't. It was the kind of weekend I needed. Quiet, isolated, and far away from the chaos of city life. I had rented a small cabin in northern New Mexico, just outside of Santa Fe. The plan was to spend a couple of days hiking, maybe even trying some fishing in the nearby river. I had been feeling overwhelmed with work lately, So this was supposed to be a break, a way to reset. But nothing about this trip turned out how I expected. The cabin itself was tucked away in the trees, the kind of place that, if you didn't know it was there, you would never find it. It was built out of weathered wood, a simple structure with a small porch and a single window that looked out into the thick pine forest. A dirt road led up to the place, winding its way through the trees, only passable by a rugged 4x4 or a pickup. I had arrived just before sundown, and the first thing I noticed was how eerily quiet it was. There was no sound except the distant rustle of the wind moving through the trees and the faint chirp of crickets. No traffic, no planes overhead, just the sound of nature, and even that felt muted, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. I parked the truck and grabbed my duffel bag from the back. The air was crisp, but not cold. Just enough of a bite to let you know you were far from the comforts of city life. I took a deep breath, the smell of pine filling my lungs. There were no neighbors around, and the nearest town was about 20 miles away. This was as remote as it got. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the smell of old wood and dust hit me. The cabin was small, with a cozy feel to it. A few pieces of mismatched furniture, an old couch, a coffee table, a small stove in the corner. The kitchen had a small fridge, a sink, and a single pot on the stove. The walls were bare, except for a couple of old paintings, scenic views of mountains and forests. It felt like the kind of place someone might stay in if they were looking to hide from the world. There was a sense of abandonment here, but not in a depressing way. More like a retreat. I spent the first evening unpacking my gear, settling into the place, and then walking around the nearby forest. It was beautiful. The towering trees, the rustling leaves, the distant sounds of animals moving through the underbrush. I didn't run into anyone. I didn't expect to. This was supposed to be a solitary experience, and I embraced it. I made some dinner, a simple canned soup, and sat by the stove with a book. As the sun set, the temperature dropped, and soon I had to stoke the fire to keep the chill out. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the wind pick up outside, I felt an odd sense of unease. It wasn't fear, exactly, more like an unsettling awareness, like I was being watched. The cabin was quiet, but it felt like there was something just beyond the trees, something I couldn't quite place. I chalked it up to being alone in the wilderness. It was easy to imagine things when you weren't used to the solitude. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I decided to go for a hike before breakfast, hoping to shake off the weird feeling I had the night before. The forest was even more breathtaking in the daylight. The trees were dense, the ground soft with pine needles. As I walked, I came across an old, half-fallen log that looked like it had been there for decades. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath and take in the view. The air smelled fresh, the kind of scent you only get in the woods. There was something peaceful about it, but also something unsettling. It was as if the woods were full of secrets, ones I wasn't meant to know. I kept walking, following a narrow trail that seemed to disappear into the deeper parts of the forest. The trail was faint, hardly visible, but it was there. I had read about people getting lost in these woods, and I made a mental note to turn back soon. But as I walked deeper into the trees, the feeling of being watched came back, stronger this time. It wasn't just in my mind. I could almost feel the weight of eyes on me. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was just my imagination running wild. But when I turned around to head back to the cabin, something caught my eye. A movement in the trees, just a flicker, like someone darting behind the trunk of a tree. I stopped. My heart skipped a beat. Could have been an animal. Could have been the wind. But something in my gut told me otherwise. I stood there, motionless, straining my ears for any sound. The forest around me was unnervingly quiet now, as if even the birds had stopped chirping. Then I heard something. A faint crunch of leaves underfoot, far off, but unmistakable. Someone was definitely out there. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was another hiker. Maybe it was someone else who had rented a cabin nearby. But the logical part of my brain was starting to panic. I wasn't alone, and whoever or whatever was out there wasn't just passing by. I turned quickly and started heading back toward the cabin, my pace quickening. The crunching behind me grew louder, closer. I could hear the heavy footsteps now, unmistakable. Someone was following me. My mind raced. Should I keep walking? Should I run? I wasn't sure, but I knew I couldn't stop. I couldn't let whoever it was catch up. My legs were starting to burn from the rapid pace, and my breath came in short, panicked gasps. I could feel the presence growing closer, closer. Then, just as I reached the cabin's clearing, I heard a shout, a hoarse, ragged voice calling out to me. I froze in place, my heart hammering in my chest. It was too far for me to make out the words, but the tone was desperate. I didn't turn around. I bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. My mind was racing. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. The forest outside was still, but I could feel that presence lurking just beyond the walls. Whoever it was had to be out there. There was no mistaking it. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every crack of a branch in the wind made me jump. I kept the lights low, hoping to avoid drawing attention to myself. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to matter if they came for me. The next day, I decided to leave. The cabin was no longer the peaceful getaway I had envisioned. I packed up my things quickly and quietly, trying not to make any noise. The thought of staying another night felt unbearable. I didn't care that I hadn't finished my hike or that I hadn't seen the full beauty of the forest. Something told me that I was no longer welcome there. As I drove down the winding dirt road, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The trees on either side seemed to close in, like they were hiding something. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone or something lurking behind me, but there was nothing. The road stretched ahead, empty and silent. I didn't look back until I reached the main highway. Even then, I couldn't fully relax until the cabin was miles behind me, and the weight on my chest lifted just a little. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back there. That place, with its beautiful views and its quiet isolation, had become a trap, and I had narrowly escaped. As I drove away, I finally allowed myself to breathe again. The further I got, the more the feeling of being watched faded. But deep down, I knew one thing for sure. That cabin had been hiding something I wasn't meant to find, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know what it was. The rain started lightly at first, a soft pitter-patter against the roof of the old cabin. But as the hours passed, it grew louder, almost like a constant drumming. It had been one of those days where everything felt off, and the more I drove down the narrow dirt roads leading to the cabin, the more I questioned my decision to come here in the first place. But I needed the peace, the silence. My mind was too full, and I thought being alone in this cabin would give me the space to think, or at the very least, to get away from everything for a while. The cabin wasn't much, just an old, weathered structure tucked away in the middle of nowhere, somewhere north of Lancaster, where the closest neighbor was miles away. The place had been in my family for generations, but it had long been abandoned, left to the elements after my grandfather passed. No one ever seemed to care to fix it up, and I was fine with that. I didn't mind the isolation. I didn't mind the way the floor creaked underfoot or how the windows rattled in the wind. It all felt familiar, like a piece of my past that I could hold on to, untouched by time. I parked my truck in front of the cabin and grabbed my bag, the door groaning as I pulled it open. Inside, the air smelled of dust and aged wood, the faint scent of something moldy hidden beneath. The place hadn't been lived in for years. The kitchen was still stocked with old cans of beans and soup, some of which were far past their expiration date. I didn't plan to stay long enough to need any of them, but I couldn't help but look around. The furniture was sparse, just a few chairs, a couch that had seen better days, and an old wood-burning stove that still had some remnants of ash in it from its last use. I set my bag down on the couch, glancing around as the rain began to pour harder, a relentless sheet of water slapping against the windows. I checked the time around 5 p.m. and figured I had a few hours of daylight left, but not much. I started a fire in the stove, the crackling warmth filling the space. The heat from the fire made the cabin feel a little more like home, a little less lonely. Still, something about being here by myself, in the middle of nowhere, made my skin crawl. It wasn't the cabin itself. It wasn't even the isolation. It was the silence. The kind of silence that pressed in on you, the kind that makes you question if you're really alone. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. After all, I had been working nonstop for months. This was supposed to be my escape, my way of clearing my head. So, I pulled up the old chair by the fire and grabbed a book from my bag, trying to lose myself in the pages. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, the sound of the rain kept gnawing at me. It wasn't normal rain. It was something heavier, more insistent, and every so often, there was a sound beneath the rain, a soft thud or creak, almost like something was moving around outside. But when I checked the windows, nothing was there. I forced myself to relax, telling myself it was probably just a branch shaking in the wind. The rain had kicked up so much that the trees were swaying with the gusts. It was easy to mistake the sound of the wind for something else, right? Right. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows against the walls, and eventually, I couldn't fight the sleepiness that settled over me. I'd been driving for hours after all, so I stretched out on the couch, pulling a blanket over myself. I didn't want to sleep, but my eyes were too heavy, and the warmth from the fire made it hard to stay awake. I drifted off into a restless sleep, my mind still buzzing with noise. And then, somewhere in the back of my consciousness, I heard it. A soft, scraping sound, almost like something was dragging along the ground just outside the cabin. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding in my chest. I held my breath, straining to listen. There it was again, a scraping, followed by the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, walking slowly across the porch. I held perfectly still, not daring to move, barely breathing. The air felt thick, heavy. My instincts screamed at me to get up, to look outside, but a part of me, the same part that had been in denial all afternoon, wanted to believe it was just an animal, a raccoon or a deer maybe, but the more I listened, the less it sounded like an animal. It was deliberate, too deliberate. I slowly got up from the couch, my legs stiff from the awkward position I'd slept in. My hands shook as I reached for the flashlight on the table, the beam cutting through the darkness of the room as I crept toward the window. The sound from outside continued, the scraping followed by that slow, deliberate pace across the porch. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I couldn't see anything through the rain, couldn't make out any figures in the darkness. The beam from my flashlight bounced off the window, catching only the blurry, gray outlines of the trees and the outline of the cabin's porch. But then, something caught my eye, a movement at the edge of the porch. It was quick, too quick, but there was something there. Someone, maybe. My breath hitched in my chest as I took a step back from the window, my mind racing. The sound of footsteps stopped for a moment, and all I could hear was the beating of my own heart in my ears. And then, a soft thud, like something heavy had been dropped on the porch, followed by a shuffling noise, and I froze in place. There was someone out there. My first instinct was to grab my keys, to rush out the door and get to my truck, but something in me hesitated. The rain was so thick outside, and the visibility was so low, I wouldn't make it far. Plus, there was no one for miles around. If I left, I'd be completely on my own, vulnerable, and exposed. I couldn't risk that, not after what I'd already heard. I retreated into the back of the cabin, grabbing the old baseball bat my grandfather had left behind. The feeling of it in my hands, the weight of it was oddly comforting. At least I'd have something to defend myself with if it came to that. I moved back to the front of the cabin, crouching low behind the sofa, the light from my flashlight illuminating the dark corners of the room. The rain continued its relentless assault against the cabin, but now I could hear something else. The shuffling on the porch had started again. Slower this time, closer. I pressed my back against the wall, listening intently, trying to gather my courage. I didn't know what I was dealing with, who I was dealing with, but my gut told me that whoever it was had no intention of leaving anytime soon. They were out there watching, waiting. Then, without warning, the front door creaked open. My heart jumped into my throat as the door swung wide, the sound of the wind and rain rushing in. I could barely make out the figure standing in the doorway, shrouded in the storm, their features hidden by the dark. But there was no mistaking the shape, tall, imposing, and far too still. I didn't think. I acted. With the bat in hand, I bolted toward the door, swinging the heavy wood with everything I had. The figure stepped back, but not quickly enough. The bat landed with a sickening thud. The person grunted, staggering back, but didn't fall. Instead, they let out a low growl that made my blood run cold. I had no idea who or what this person was, but I didn't care. I swung again, this time landing a blow against their chest, and they finally stumbled back, collapsing onto the porch. I didn't wait. I turned and ran for the back door, slamming it shut behind me, the sound of my breathing echoing in my ears as I fumbled to lock it. Outside, the storm raged on, and in the distance I thought I saw movement. Another figure, a second person, but I couldn't wait to find out. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get to the truck and drive as fast as I could. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and ran out the back, not daring to look behind me. I wasn't sure how long I ran, but eventually, I reached the truck, and the engine roared to life as I sped away, leaving the cabin behind. And as I drove, the rain poured down, but the silence felt different now, more oppressive, more unsettling. I didn't look back, and I never went back. It had been years since I had been in the French countryside. I was 28 now, far older than the last time I came here, and this time I was alone. It was early October, just on the edge of fall, the kind of season where the mornings are crisp and the days still carry the lingering warmth of summer. I was tired, worn down by life. Between the stress of my job in Paris and the complications of city life, I felt like I needed to get away. The old family cabin in the middle of nowhere sounded like the perfect place to escape. The place was remote, miles away from the nearest village, tucked deep in a thicket of pine trees. My great-uncle had built the cabin when he was young, decades ago. He had long passed, but the cabin still stood sturdy, though its age showed in the crumbling stone and weather-beaten wood. The key was still under the same rock out front, just like he had told me years ago. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I figured that being here would allow me some peace, a chance to breathe and regroup before heading back to the chaos of daily life. I drove through the winding roads that led into the forest, the familiar silence of the woods pressing in. The forest was thick, the trees rising tall like silent sentinels. I didn't mind. I'd always felt a connection to nature. As I passed a few rusted old farmhouses, I could feel my unease growing, but I brushed it off. It was just the solitude. I wasn't used to being alone anymore. In the city, the noise never stops. Here, everything was quiet. Eventually, I pulled up to the cabin. It was just as I remembered. Small, with a faded red roof, surrounded by overgrown shrubbery. The path leading to the door was uneven, and the old stone steps were cracked. I could already tell that the cabin had not been maintained for years, though it still had a strange charm to it. I grabbed my backpack from the car, walked to the door, and retrieved the key from the familiar hiding spot. The lock creaked, the door groaning as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the kind of smell that comes from a place left untouched for too long. The wooden floorboards creaked under my weight as I stepped in. It was colder than I expected, even for a fall day. The windows were boarded up, allowing only a few slivers of light to pierce the gloom. I turned on the lights, but they flickered before settling into a dim glow. Nothing worked perfectly here, and that was fine by me. I didn't need comfort. I needed isolation. I unpacked my things and started a small fire in the fireplace. It crackled, sending warmth throughout the room. The flames danced, casting strange shadows on the walls. As the fire burned, I began to feel the weight of the silence. There was no wind, No sound of animals, just the crackle of the fire and my own breathing. It was unnerving, but I tried not to think too much about it. The more I focused on the quiet, the more I realized how alone I was, how far removed from everything. I sat in the worn leather chair by the fire, sipping a glass of wine, staring into the flames. The night drew closer, and the temperature dropped even further. I pulled a blanket around my shoulders, the flickering light casting long shadows around the room. It was almost surreal, this quiet, this sense of being completely cut off from the world. For the first time in a long time, I felt a weight lift off my chest. This place was exactly what I needed. The first night passed without incident. I woke up early the next morning to the sound of birds chirping outside. I could hear the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, serene. I made a cup of coffee and stepped outside to take in the view of the forest. The mist had settled in, swirling between the trees like a ghostly veil. The air was thick, but there was something calming about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right, though. A subtle sense of discomfort lingered in the back of my mind, but I didn't acknowledge it. It was probably nothing. The second day was uneventful. I spent the morning exploring the surrounding woods, taking in the fresh air, and getting lost in my thoughts. By late afternoon, I decided to take a walk further into the woods, beyond the familiar paths I knew from childhood. As I wandered deeper into the forest, the trees grew thicker, the ground muddier. It felt like the woods were closing in on me, and though I didn't want to admit it, I could feel a presence, a watchful gaze. I stopped by a small stream to rest, sitting on a large rock, staring at the water as it rushed past. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. The quiet had returned, and in that silence, I felt something stir. I couldn't place it, just a deep, instinctual feeling that something was off. When I opened my eyes, I saw something, movement. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer perhaps, but when I looked closer, I realized it wasn't. It was a figure standing still just beyond the trees. My heart rate spiked. It wasn't anyone I knew, not anyone who would be out here. I stood up quickly, trying to get a better look, but by the time I did, the figure had disappeared. I froze, my mind racing. Was it someone else lost in the woods? The thought gave me a slight sense of relief, but something didn't sit right. The woods were vast, and the figure had been far too still, too quiet. I hurried back to the cabin, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I tried to shake it off, but as the evening settled in, I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that I wasn't alone. I bolted the door behind me, an unnecessary precaution, but I did it anyway. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the unease still crept up on me. I stayed close to the fire, keeping my eyes on the shadows in the corners of the room. Night fell, and once again, the silence settled in around me. I tried to sleep, but the feeling of being watched kept me awake. I finally drifted off, but not for long. I was awoken in the dead of night by a sound outside the cabin, something scraping against the wood. It wasn't a branch moving in the wind or an animal scurrying. No, this was deliberate, slow. My heart raced as I lay still in bed, listening. The sound came again, a scraping, then a thud, followed by silence. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window, peering out through a crack in the boarded-up boards. There was nothing there. No person, no animal, just the darkened woods, empty and still. But I knew something had been out there. I could feel it. The night stretched on, each hour dragging on longer than the last. I barely slept, my mind racing with every creak of the cabin. When the morning light finally broke through the trees, I stepped outside, hoping to shake off the dread that had settled over me. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the tree line, at the edge of the forest, was a set of footprints. They were fresh, barely disturbed by the morning dew. My blood ran cold. They weren't animal tracks. They were human, and they were coming from the direction of the cabin. I turned to look at the cabin, my heart hammering in my chest. Had someone been watching me last night? Had they been the one scraping at the door? I felt a tightness in my chest as the realization hit me. I was not alone. I didn't wait around to investigate. I grabbed my things, packed what I could, and drove back to the village. I couldn't get out of the woods fast enough. The drive back felt endless, the road twisting and turning in a blur. By the time I made it to the main road, the adrenaline had begun to fade, leaving only a lingering fear in my gut. I never went back to the cabin. The strange figure, the scraping noises, and the footprints, whatever was out there, it wasn't something I could explain. I never found out who or what had been watching me in the woods, but I never needed to know. The cabin was better left behind, a memory of something far too unsettling to return to. The first thing I noticed when I arrived was the smell of damp wood and rotting leaves. It was early autumn, and the forest around me was a patchwork of browns, yellows, and fading greens. I had been planning this weekend getaway for months, desperate for some quiet time alone. It wasn't the kind of vacation I normally took. No beach resorts or city escapes. This was a cabin, tucked away deep in the woods, hours from any town. The cabin was old, really old. I'd found it online, a little listing that promised solitude and comfort. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was exactly what I needed. Peace and quiet, and a chance to clear my head after a stressful year. I'd arrived late in the afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky as I unpacked my car. The cabin itself sat back from the main road, nestled into the side of a small hill. It was small, made of rough-hewn logs that were beginning to show their age, a little crooked but sturdy. There was a small porch with an old rocking chair on the front. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn tight, making the place seem even more isolated than it was. The door creaked when I opened it, and I couldn't help but notice how the smell of mold seemed to hit me immediately. The place had clearly been abandoned for a while. Dust covered every surface, and the wood floors looked like they hadn't been swept in months. There was a fireplace in the living room, surrounded by mismatched furniture. An old, sagging couch sat in the corner next to a low wooden coffee table. The place had a lived-in feel, but also the unmistakable presence of neglect. No one had stayed here for a long time. I set my bags down by the door and took a deep breath. Despite the disrepair, it was peaceful. The silence outside the cabin was thick, the only sounds coming from the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of a bird. It was perfect, exactly what I had wanted. I spent the first few hours cleaning up, sweeping the dust from the floors, wiping down the kitchen counters, and opening up the windows to let in fresh air. The sun was dipping behind the trees by the time I finished, and I was exhausted, so I decided to light a fire in the hearth and settle in for the evening. I grabbed the stack of firewood from the porch and started the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. As night settled in, I made myself a simple dinner, a can of soup and a piece of bread, and ate while sitting in the chair next to the fire. The warmth from the flames spread through the room, making the cabin feel cozier. For the first time in months, I felt at ease. But then, something strange happened. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees. At first, it didn't seem odd. Autumn winds were common in the woods. But then I heard something else. A soft, scratching sound coming from the door. I paused, my spoon hovering mid-air, listening. It wasn't loud, just a faint noise, like something was dragging along the wooden surface of the door. I tried to ignore it, but the sound persisted, growing louder. I stood up and approached the door cautiously, my heart rate picking up. I opened it, but there was nothing outside, just the cold, dark woods stretching out in every direction. The wind whipped through the trees, but there was no sign of what had made the sound. I stood there for a few moments, scanning the darkness, trying to shake off the unease that had crept over me. The night was quiet once more. I closed the door and locked it, though I didn't feel much safer. The feeling of being watched was beginning to creep in, a slow, persistent thought that gnawed at the back of my mind. I tried to brush it off and went back to my dinner, but the tension in the air hadn't lifted. The fire crackled and popped, sending occasional sparks up the chimney. I couldn't stop glancing at the door, though. It felt like something was out there, lurking just beyond the edges of the light. It wasn't until much later, when I had finished eating and was ready to settle into bed, that I realized the cabin had grown unnaturally cold. I wrapped myself in a blanket and turned in for the night, though sleep was elusive. The wind howled against the cabin, but it was the silence between gusts that felt heavier, more oppressive. That night, I was woken up by the sound of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate steps, heavy and almost purposeful. I froze, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was hearing. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. Someone or something was out there. The footsteps continued, pausing just beyond the edge of the cabin. They were too slow to be a passing animal, too regular to be a random occurrence. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but the footsteps stopped. I waited for what felt like hours, my eyes wide open in the darkness, trying to listen through the heavy silence. But nothing came. The footsteps never resumed. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, maybe some animal in the woods playing tricks on my mind. I didn't want to leave the safety of the bed, but my instincts told me I needed to check. I had to be sure. I grabbed a flashlight from the side table and slowly made my way to the door. My hands were trembling as I gripped the handle, but I turned it anyway. The door opened with a groan, revealing nothing but the dark, empty porch. No one was there, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I stepped outside, shining the flashlight around. The beam cut through the darkness, but everything seemed normal. The trees swayed in the wind, the leaves rustling softly. Still, something didn't feel right. Then I saw it. Just beyond the porch, in the shadows of the trees, a figure stood motionless. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was too still, too silent. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape against the blackness of the woods. I didn't move. My mind raced, but I couldn't find any logical explanation for what I was seeing. Was it a person? An animal? A trick of the light? Then, the figure stepped forward, just a bit, as if it had been waiting for me to notice it. My heart pounded in my chest as I slammed the door shut, the cold metal lock clicking into place. I backed away from the door, my mind spinning with questions, but no answers. There was no way I could sleep now. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room, the flashlight in my hand, watching the door. My thoughts were a blur, but one thing was clear: I wasn't alone. By morning, the feeling of dread had only deepened. The sun rose, casting a pale light over the trees, but it didn't ease my unease. I decided to leave the cabin. I grabbed my things, packed my car, and left before the day could fully unfold. As I drove away, I took one last look at the cabin. It sat there, still and silent, nestled in the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me the entire time I had been there. It wasn't until weeks later, when I spoke to the owner of the cabin, that I learned the truth. Apparently, a man had gone missing in those woods years ago. He'd been staying in a cabin just a few miles from mine. They never found his body, just a trail of blood leading into the trees. And the footsteps I had heard, they were a warning. I'll never know who or what I saw that night, but I've never been back to those woods, and I never will. The forest was silent when I arrived at the cabin. I remember that part clearly. It had been one of those rare days when the weather was perfect, overcast, cool, not a breath of wind. It was just before dusk, and everything felt still. Too still, almost. The kind of quiet that you could feel creeping up your spine. The cabin was hidden deep in the woods. I had been told it was my great-uncle's old hunting lodge, but it felt more like a forgotten piece of history. The gravel road leading up to it was narrow, barely wide enough for my truck to fit. And as I drove, I couldn't shake the thought that I might be the first person to drive down this path in years, maybe even decades. I had decided to spend the weekend alone. After everything that had happened in the last few months, I needed some space. I needed to be away from people, away from the noise of life. The cabin had always been a kind of retreat for my uncle, a man of few words and even fewer visitors. When he passed, no one had shown much interest in the place. It had been left to me, not that I had known about it until recently. But something about the solitude of the woods, the quiet and the promise of nothing, was exactly what I needed. The cabin itself looked worn. The wood was old and faded, the shingles on the roof missing in places, the windows boarded up with hastily nailed planks. It looked abandoned, like no one had cared for it in years. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped out of the truck, and I felt a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. I grabbed my gear, making sure to bring everything I thought I might need. Food, water, a flashlight, a first aid kit. It wasn't that I expected anything bad to happen. I just knew it was better to be prepared. There was a stillness in the air that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I brushed it off as nothing more than my nerves settling in. Inside the cabin, dust had gathered on every surface, and the smell of musty wood and old leather filled the air. The furniture was minimal. A couple of chairs, a small wooden table, a faded couch by the window that faced out into the woods. There was a fireplace, stone and sturdy, with a pile of firewood stacked beside it. The whole place felt like it hadn't seen a living soul in years. I spent the first few hours settling in, trying to get comfortable. I opened the windows to let in what little fresh air there was, but the quiet was unsettling. I didn't know why it bothered me so much, but there was something about the silence, about the way it seemed to press in on me, that didn't feel right. The woods outside seemed too empty, the trees too still. By nightfall, I had a fire going in the hearth. I cooked a simple meal, ate, and then cleaned up. It was during the cleanup that I first heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from outside. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel, but the sound was persistent, deliberate, almost like something was pacing around the cabin. I froze, the dish I was holding slipping from my hands and crashing to the floor. I stood there, listening. The scratching continued, and then, for a moment, everything stopped. The silence returned, and I couldn't tell if it was worse now that the noise had stopped or if it had been more unsettling before. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and slowly made my way to the door. I didn't open it right away, but I peered through the cracks in the old wood. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, but there was nothing, just trees. More trees, nothing moving. I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. The fire crackled in the hearth, and I tried to brush it off as nothing. Maybe an animal had been caught in the wind, or maybe it was just my nerves. But then the scratching returned, louder this time, closer. It sounded like it was coming from the side of the cabin, where the windows were boarded up. I crept toward the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought it was going to die on me. But it stayed on, its beam cutting through the dark like a knife. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to see what it was. I slowly unlatched the door, the noise of the mechanism echoing in the cabin. Stepping outside, I scanned the area around the cabin, my flashlight moving back and forth across the trees and ground. Nothing seemed out of place, but then I saw it. A shadow moved near the edge of the woods. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was a figure, barely visible, standing between the trees just out of the light's reach. I called out, but my voice felt weak, like it wasn't mine. The figure didn't move. I took a step forward, but that was when the scratching started again, coming from the opposite side of the cabin. And then from behind me, I heard it. Something moving, something heavy. I spun around, but by the time I did, there was nothing there. No figure, no sound, just the rustling of the leaves in the trees. The air felt thick now, heavy, like the weight of something unseen was pressing down on me. I didn't know what to do. I went back inside, locking the door again, and tried to calm myself down. The fire was still burning brightly in the hearth, but the warmth seemed to be gone now. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. Hours passed in uneasy silence. Every creak of the cabin, every crack of the fire, made my heart race. I didn't sleep, couldn't. I just sat there, waiting for something to happen, for the next sound, the next movement. But nothing came. By morning, I was exhausted but felt the strange sense that I had somehow made it through the worst of it. The The scratching, the figure, the strange sounds, they were gone. The cabin was still. The woods were still. The world outside felt far away, distant, like it belonged to someone else. I packed my things and left, not bothering to check the cabin one last time. I didn't need to. I knew what I had felt. I knew what I had heard. And whatever it was, I didn't want to stay another minute. The drive out of the woods was a blur. The roads seemed longer, the trees darker, and I didn't look back. I hadn't spoken to my stepsister Leanne much in the past few years, not because of any real reason. Life just kind of pulled us in different directions. I worked at a parts warehouse down in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and spent most of my time alone when I wasn't clocked in. She married a cop, some guy named Rick, and they moved up north closer to the West Virginia border. He worked highway patrol or something similar. Not the kind of guy I ever figured she'd end up with, but she seemed happy. That's what mattered. It was late September of 2017 when she invited me out to stay at a cabin Rick had inherited from his uncle. Said they'd been fixing it up here and there when they had time, and that it was about ready for people to stay over. They were planning a little weekend out there, just the three of us. I didn't ask why, but later I understood they wanted someone else there. Not for fun, but for safety. I didn't know that part when I said yes. I drove up Friday morning in my old Ford Ranger, taking the back roads past New Market and into the mountains. By the time I made it up to the ridge at Dalton Creek, the sun was nearly overhead. The road to the cabin wasn't marked, just a gap in the trees with a metal cattle gate that had been pushed open. The truck bounced over ruts and rocks as I crawled through dense forest. Pine needles blanketed the road. Smelled like wet moss and old wood, kind of peaceful. The cabin was tucked up on a slope that overlooked a narrow, winding creek. It was smaller than I expected, single story, wide porch, green roof stained dark by the rain and years. A chimney on one side, the kind of place that looked abandoned from the outside, except for Rick's Dodge Charger parked just off the gravel turnaround. Leanne came out to greet me, looking thinner than I remembered. Her hair was pulled back, and she wore a fleece over jeans. Rick stood behind her on the porch, arms crossed, scanning the woods like he was working a case. I noticed it right away. Something was off. They weren't acting like a couple out on a weekend trip. They looked tired, both of them, like they hadn't slept. Inside the cabin was warmer than expected. A fire crackled in a stone hearth. The air smelled of split pine and old blankets. There were only 2 bedrooms and a small kitchen. No TV, no radio, no cell service. Leanne had me bunk in the smaller room. I dropped my duffel on the bed and went back out. Rick was sitting at the table, going over something in a black notebook. I didn't ask. It wasn't my business. I figured he was working out some police paperwork. That evening we ate chili Leanne had made, drank some beer, and sat out on the porch under the stars. Should have been relaxing, should have been quiet, but every few minutes, Rick would get up and sweep a flashlight across the trees. Leanne flinched each time he did. I didn't ask questions that night. The next morning, Rick was gone. His car was still there, but he wasn't inside or around the cabin. I woke up to the sound of Leanne pacing the kitchen floor. She told me he'd gone to check the trail that led down the ridge, said he did it every morning, like clockwork. I stepped outside with a cup of coffee and waited on the porch. Sunlight bled through the trees, warming the damp earth. I saw no sign of him. By noon, she was getting worried. By 1, she was in tears. She finally told me everything. Over the last few months, Rick had been driving up to this cabin after work, checking things out. Someone or something had been coming up onto the property. He kept finding boot prints in the dirt around the cabin. Things moved inside the shed, scraps of fabric caught on trees, weird little things out of place. No sign of forced entry, but the shed door was twice found unlocked when he swore he'd latched it. The final straw had been when he saw a man, at least what he thought was a man, standing near the base of the ridge one night just before sunset. Tall, thin, wearing dark clothes. Didn't move, just stood there, partly behind a tree. Rick yelled. The figure didn't respond. When Rick hiked down with his flashlight, the man was gone. He thought maybe it was a squatter, or someone using the place for drug runs, since it wasn't too far from the old forestry road. He hadn't told his station about it, said it wasn't worth writing up, but it bugged him. So now here we were. I hiked down the trail around 2, hoping to run into him. The trees grew tight together in that part of the forest, pines and old oaks casting long shadows even in daylight. There were old animal trails crisscrossing the hill. I followed the path about half a mile down to where the woods opened slightly. Found nothing. Then I saw the boot prints. They weren't fresh, but they weren't Rick's. He wore police-issue boots. These were something else, deeper tread, longer step. They led off the trail between 2 boulders and into a narrow gully. I followed them for maybe 20 yards before I stopped. The ground sloped steeply, slick with dead leaves. And then I smelled it. Something foul, wet metal and rot, came in waves, like something dead was down there. I backed out. I told Leanne when I got back. She didn't say much, just nodded and locked the doors. That night, Rick still didn't return. We stayed up late. The fire burned low, and the only light came from the oil lantern Leanne hung near the window. Every now and then, we both turned to look outside. The trees didn't move. The dark didn't give up anything. Then, around midnight, we heard it. Footsteps, crunching leaves just outside the back wall. Slow, measured, like someone walking in a wide circle around the cabin. Leanne grabbed Rick's sidearm from the top of the cupboard. She didn't hesitate. I stayed crouched near the table, watching the windows. The steps paused, then picked up again. Closer now. We both moved into the bedroom and killed the light. Silence. Then something scratched against the back wall. Light, deliberate, like a stick dragged across wood. It stopped after a few seconds. We stayed like that for over an hour, not speaking, not moving, just waiting. At dawn, we went out. No one was there, but we saw the trail. Tracks leading around the cabin, prints spaced wide like someone pacing in a slow loop. Same tread as the ones I'd seen off the trail. Same direction, same distance between steps. But here's the thing, the tracks came up to the back wall and never turned around. No returning prints. That day, Leanne wanted to leave, but Rick's car keys were gone. We searched every room, every drawer. Nothing. His bag was still there. His badge, wallet, everything, except the keys. She swore they were on the table the night before. That afternoon, I hiked back down to the spot I'd found the smell. This time, I followed the gully deeper. I don't know what I expected. Maybe to find a deer carcass or an old fire pit. But what I saw was worse. I found a camp. Small, rough, hidden in a hollow behind a stand of black pines. There was a tarp strung between trees, a pile of stripped sticks, burnt food cans, and a blackened pot. A rolled-up sleeping bag half buried under leaves. But no sign of anyone there now. Then I saw what really stopped me. Nailed into the tree behind the camp were dozens of small animal bones, strung up with twine, arranged in circles and spirals, cleaned, organized. I stood there, staring at it, unable to move. Then I saw something else, Rick's name, carved into the bark, just once, clean and straight. Not his full name, just Rick. Deep grooves, fresh. I turned and walked straight back up to the cabin. Told Leanne everything. We packed what we could in 30 minutes and started walking. We didn't wait. Took only what we could carry and followed the forestry road south, hoping to catch a car or find cell service. 3 hours later, a park ranger spotted us near the old trailhead. He called for backup. We were taken to the nearest sheriff's office and gave our statements. They sent 2 units to the cabin. They didn't find Rick. They did find the camp I described, but they didn't find anyone there, and the bones were gone. The following weeks were filled with interviews, follow-ups, search efforts. Leanne stayed with me in Harrisonburg for a while. She stopped sleeping. I barely ate. Rick's disappearance was filed as unresolved missing persons. No foul play determined. That was over 7 years ago. I haven't been back to that ridge since. The cabin was sold. The new owners cleared most of the trees around it, installed cameras, and put up new fencing. They say it's peaceful now, but I know better. Sometimes I still wonder what Rick saw out there, who he saw, or what he figured out too late. I think about the name carved into that tree, the footprints that stopped at the wall, the missing keys. I never asked for answers after that. I don't think I want them, and I don't think I'll ever step foot in those woods again. It was late in the fall, and the air had that crisp, biting chill that only comes when the leaves are just about gone, leaving behind bare branches that groaned under the weight of the wind. I didn't have a lot of time, but something told me I needed to be alone, away from everything. The weight of the world, or maybe just the weight of my thoughts, felt like too much lately. My uncle had passed away a few months earlier, and I hadn't had the chance to properly process it all. But now there was something else, an inheritance. My uncle, Charles, had owned a small cabin in the middle of nowhere. He'd lived there for as long as I could remember, even before I was born. The place was isolated, perched in the woods, surrounded by the remnants of an old cemetery, headstones worn down by years of neglect. It wasn't a place I'd ever thought about much. Not as a child, not as an adult. But now I was left to take care of it. The idea of returning there filled me with an odd mixture of dread and curiosity. A few family members had given their condolences and moved on, but I'd never been one to ignore things that needed to be done. I guess that's why I found myself standing in front of the cabin that afternoon, after a long drive through dirt roads and winding paths. The cabin itself was a simple, two-story structure with a wraparound porch and a couple of windows that looked out over the graveyard. The wood was aged and dark, its surface chipped and cracked from years of weather. It sat like a forgotten relic of the past, its only company being the graveyard that stretched beyond it. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the musty smell of wet leaves and old wood mixing with the sharp tang of the distant pine trees. I stood there for a moment, just staring at it, wondering if my uncle had really lived here alone all these years. The place was eerie, silent except for the occasional rustling of a squirrel or the distant call of a bird. But there was something unsettling about it. Maybe it was the graveyard, or maybe it was just the emptiness of the whole place. I shook it off, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. I had a job to do. There was no reason to get worked up over something as simple as a cabin. I walked up to the door and found it unlocked, which was strange. My uncle had always been a cautious man, and I was sure he would have kept the place locked. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my boots. The air inside was stale, like it hadn't been aired out in years. Dust settled on every surface, and the smell of old leather and tobacco hung in the air. The cabin wasn't much to look at. It was furnished simply with a couch, a few chairs, a dining table, and a small kitchen. The fireplace was cold, and the bookshelves were lined with old, yellowing books. The walls were adorned with faded pictures of people I didn't recognize, along with a few of my uncle in his younger days. But it didn't feel like his home anymore. It felt like something else. I ventured further inside, feeling a strange sense of claustrophobia, as if the house was closing in on me. The staircase to the second floor was narrow and steep, and I hesitated for a moment before deciding to check out the rest of the house. Maybe it was because I didn't want to be in the main room alone, or maybe it was just that nagging feeling that something wasn't right. The second floor was even quieter than the first, if that was possible. It looked like a simple sleeping area with a bed, a couple of chairs, and an old writing desk. But there was something else here, something that caught my attention immediately. On the far wall, there was a large, worn-out cabinet. It looked out of place, and for a second, I wondered why my uncle had kept it. It wasn't his style. He was a minimalist in every sense of the word. But the cabinet was old, with brass handles that had long since tarnished. I opened it, and inside, I found a small collection of items that seemed almost out of context for the cabin. There were several old books, most of them on obscure topics, philosophy, history, and some that appeared to be handwritten journals. But the most curious thing was a small wooden box tucked away at the back of the cabinet. I took the box out and set it on the desk, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It was small, no bigger than a shoebox, with intricate carvings on the lid. I opened it slowly, expecting to find something insignificant, but inside, there was only one item: an old photograph. The picture was of my uncle standing in front of the cabin, but the image was faded and scratched. The strangest thing about it was the shadow in the background. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but the longer I stared at it, the more it seemed wrong. The shadow was too distinct, too human, but it wasn't my uncle. I turned the photo over, and in small, careful handwriting it said, *, he's still here. Don't come back, *. A chill ran through me, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something much deeper than just the cabin itself. I stood there, staring at the photo, unsure of what to do next. I had been expecting something, a letter, a will, something practical to tell me what I was supposed to do with the cabin. But this was something else entirely. I decided to head outside for a bit to clear my head. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the graveyard. The wind had picked up, and the leaves rustled restlessly. I walked toward the graveyard, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. It was too quiet, too still. As I stepped between the rows of gravestones, I noticed something strange. There was one grave that looked different from the others. It was newer, the stones still pristine, with no signs of weathering. I walked closer, squinting to read the name etched into the stone. It read, * Charles M. Tiller, 1963 to 2020. *. I felt my heart skip a beat. My uncle's name, but that didn't make sense. He had died just a few months ago, and I had been there for the funeral. There was no way this grave could have been placed just recently. I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out at me from behind a tree, but there was no one. I kneeled down and ran my fingers over the stone. The coldness of it sent another shiver through me. As I stood up, I noticed something else. A small patch of disturbed earth beside the grave. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me question what I was seeing. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a twig snapping. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I turned quickly, but there was no one there. Just the trees, the wind, and the endless expanse of the graveyard. But then, I saw something, movement, a flicker between the gravestones. I could just make out a figure, a person, standing among the tombstones, watching me. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest, but I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. It had to be. The silence, the isolation, it was all getting to me. I turned and hurried back to the cabin, my pulse racing. The night fell quickly, and the cabin became even more oppressive, as though it were pressing in from all sides. I locked the door behind me and tried to focus on something, anything, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. I could feel it, creeping along the walls, in the creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet. I decided to head to bed, hoping that sleep would come and give me some relief. But as I lay there in the dark, listening to the wind howl outside, I heard it again, a faint scratching sound. It came from the walls, faint at first, like someone or something was trying to get in. I tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder, more persistent. It wasn't just scratching anymore. It was thumping, like something was being dragged across the floor above me. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. There was no one upstairs. The second floor was empty. I grabbed a flashlight and crept up the stairs, the beam of light trembling in my hand. The noise stopped as soon as I reached the top. The room was exactly as I had left it, the air thick with dust and silence. I checked the windows, the doors, nothing seemed out of place. But then I saw it. At the edge of the room, near the back wall, there was a door I had missed before. It was partially open, just enough for me to see the dark, narrow hallway behind it. I walked toward it, the flashlight flickering in my hand. I pushed the door open, and that's when I saw it. A hidden room, filled with old furniture, old trunks, and a coffin. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't supposed to be here. The room was sealed off, locked away. And yet, there it was. A wooden coffin, placed carefully on the floor, as though waiting for someone to open it. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and as I reached out to lift the lid, I heard it again. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. Just the coffin, the dust, and the eerie silence of the cabin. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and backed away, my mind racing. I knew I had to leave, but something kept me there, rooted to the spot. I didn't know how much longer I stayed in that cabin,